Well, we're expecting them to talk about two main topics. Of course, there's going to be the looming deadline for this shutdown, and then on top of that, they're expected to talk about Ukraine funding. Let's start with that looming shutdown deadline. We've got just a few days for them to work out a deal. Five government agencies are going to face a shutdown at 11:59 Friday night. This is the first of two deadlines. March 8th is the second one, and that's when we would see a full government shutdown. So there's really not a lot of time, especially because the House doesn't return until Wednesday. So they're going to have just 3 working days to try and figure out a deal here. Now, they both want a full budget, but we've been here before, and in the past, they've sometimes relied on these short-term spending stopgap measures. So, of course, we could see something like that yet again, just to sort of kick it down the road, whether it's a few weeks or a month. That's what they've done in the past. So we'll see what happens there. The other issue is about Ukraine funding. President Biden has been pushing for some $60 billion to go in foreign aid to Ukraine. A bill did pass in the Senate with bipartisan support, but the question is going to be whether it gets a vote in the House. That's really unclear. All this as we have 2 years of war in Ukraine marked last weekend. Josh?
Yeah, and Evan, briefly, in Ukraine, thousands of miles away on battlefields there, Ukraine has seen increasing losses as soldiers save ammunition because of the stalling of this aid by Congress. Any indication that Republicans could give that assistance to Kyiv anytime soon?
Well, there is bipartisan appetite for this funding. We saw that in the Senate, where it got some 70 yes votes, including 22 Republicans. But the big question is whether it's going to get a vote in the House. It likely would have the votes, but Speaker Mike Johnson has a big decision about whether to allow a vote on this, especially when many Republicans in the base are against this funding going to Ukraine, including the former president, Donald Trump, who's the Republican frontrunner. So the big question is whether he would bring it up for a vote. There is the opportunity to do a discharge petition. Democrats could choose to do that to sort of circumvent him. They would just need a few Republicans to turn on the speaker. But this is rare and it's often taboo. So really, I think at this moment, all eyes are on Speaker Mike Johnson, what he decides to do, whether or not this will get a vote. Josh?
Okay, Evan Koslof at the White House. Thank you.
Right, the president was speaking with the top 4 congressional leaders where they're expected to speak about 2 main topics. The first is this looming deadline for a partial government shutdown. And then on top of that, he wanted to talk about Ukraine funding, a proposal to send some $60 billion in military aid to Ukraine. Take a listen to what he had to say about that.
And Ukraine, I think the need is urgent. I hope we get to speak to that a little bit. And I think the consequences of inaction every day in Ukraine are dire.
So President Biden talking there about a foreign aid package where he wants to send some $60 billion to Ukraine. This bill did pass in the Senate with bipartisan support. Some 70 senators, including 22 Republicans, signed on to this. But the big question is going to be whether or not it's going to get a vote in the House. That's when there's going to be a lot of attention on Speaker Mike Johnson, whether he's going to support Ukraine funding. And then on top of that, they need to figure out what they're going to do to avoid a partial government shutdown. They need to strike a deal on that by 11:59 on Friday. So they've got a lot of work to do inside the Oval Office. From the White House, I'm Evan Koslof, Spectrum News.
Okay, Evan, thank you.
Right, the top 4 congressional leaders invited to talk about some heavy issues. First off, this looming deadline for a partial government shutdown, as you mentioned, Friday night at 11:59. If they don't get a deal by then, 5 government agencies would shut down. And then on top of that, this proposal to send some $60 billion in military aid to Ukraine. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer described the meeting about that as the most intense meeting he's been a part of. He just got back from a visit to Ukraine. Take a listen to why he said this meeting was so intense.
I was so shaken by what I saw at the border. I was strengthened by the strength of Zelensky and the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian soldiers, but shaken that here they are fighting without arms against a brutal dictator who will just do anything to kill them.
Meanwhile, in regards to this looming deadline, both sides expressed some optimism that they could strike a deal here. Speaker Mike Johnson said that the conversations they had were frank and honest, also saying that he spoke one-on-one with President Biden, emphasizing that to him and to his party, action on the southern border is what should be the top priority. That being said, take a listen to why he said he believes action will happen on this shutdown.
We're very optimistic. I hope that the other leaders came out here and told you the same. We believe that we can get to agreement on these issues and prevent a government shutdown, and that's our first responsibility.
So meanwhile, on this Ukraine funding, the big question is, will we see that move in the near future? There is a bipartisan appetite, a bill sending $60 billion passed in the Senate with bipartisan support, some 70 yes votes, including 22 Republicans. The big question, though, is will it make any progress there in the House? The meeting brought the top 2 congressional Democrats and the top 2 congressional Republicans here to the White House to try and find common ground. And while both sides expressed optimism that they could strike a deal to avert a government shutdown, the path forward on funding for Ukraine is far less clear.
I think the consequences of inaction every day in Ukraine are dire.
President Joe Biden opening a meeting with the 4 congressional leaders with a plea to help Ukraine.
We said to the Speaker, get it done.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer speaking in emotional terms, saying everyone who attended the White House sit-down, from the president to Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, urged Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson to bring the Ukraine aid package passed by the Senate up for a vote.
It's maybe 4 or 5 times that history is looking over your shoulder. And if you don't do the right thing, whatever the immediate politics are, you will regret it.
But emerging from the meeting, Johnson said that the country's first priority must be securing the southern border. He called avoiding a government shutdown another imperative. He did not list Ukraine as a priority and was non-committal about what House Republicans might do.
The House is actively pursuing and investigating all the various options on that, and we will address that in a timely manner. But again, the first priority of the country is our border and making sure it's secure.
Johnson says that he spoke one-on-one with the president, saying he urged Biden to take executive action on the border. The House is set to return to session on Wednesday. They'll have just 3 days to avoid a partial government shutdown. The money will run out for 5 government agencies if they can't get a deal by 11:59 Friday night.
I'm cautiously optimistic that we can do what is necessary within the next day or so.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer suggesting today that they may need to rely on a short-term stopgap funding measure to keep the government open past Friday night while they look for a permanent deal. Here at the White House, I'm Evan Koslof, Spectrum News.
Real uncertainty when it comes to Ukraine funding. What are the politics at play here causing this divide?
Well, there's absolutely a bipartisan appetite for this Ukraine funding. Case in point, look at the Senate bill that passed with some 70 votes, including some 22 Republicans. So the thought is that it would pass if it ever got onto the House floor. But the question is whether Speaker Mike Johnson wants to bring this onto the floor, considering many members of the Republican base are opposed to this funding. So that includes, I should mention, former President Donald Trump. So the big question is whether this bill will actually get a vote on the House floor. And that right now, Sharon, is pretty unclear.
All right, Evan Koslof, thanks.